So, the first question, which you would have seen, is how did your love and connection with seaweed begin? Because obviously you've created like a beautiful load of art for Seaweed Stories. So, what was your journey to that point?
Well, I suppose it actually starts quite a long time ago. I think there are 2 points of reference in my past that I can remember seaweed suddenly going ping. And I guess one is the west coast of Scotland. So I was at uni when I did my first degree in literature in Edinburgh, and the west coast of Scotland has beautiful seaweeds and beautiful shorelines with full of seaweeds like we do here in Cornwall. And so I guess that was an initial kind of trigger, but that ping point that I just said, I think I was on Porthgwara here in Cornwall, and just noticed what I now know to be a tiny little frond of Calophyllus, so red seaweed, floating. And it was just, I guess, against the sort of shell and sand, the sort of blondie coloured shell and sand, it just really zinged. And that, I think, was the moment I lost my heart.
Oh, that's really awesome.
So those are in the past. And then I guess the Seaweed Stories bit, as I've been calling it, was really just prior to lockdown last year. So I've had a lot of interaction with our cove here, which is just 5 minutes from my studio, over the last 10 years. And seaweed has become a very big part of that. And as you say, a big part of what ends up being created in the artwork. But I think, that rock pooling just prior to lockdown last year, I really kind of focused me in and on this sort of more later body of work. I've got others in the past,
which we can get to in a bit. Yeah, that is really wholesome. I love that. Do you think sort of what attracted you most was the beauty of it, or like the science of it, or both?
I would say, initially when I described seeing the red floating, I would say that's wholly just the beauty. That's just the stunning beauty of frond of seaweed floating in our waters here, and the translucency of it, and so all of those things that I can now see coming out of my artwork were there in that kind of single piece. So I guess that's aesthetic, that's the beauty. But definitely over this past year, and I've always been interested in that kind of crossover and learning more about the things in nature that I'm noticing. But I would say definitely over this last year, what you're saying, the science aspect of it has come to the fore in terms of seaweed. It's been there a bit over the last decade, but it's been this focusing in since that rock pooling just prior to lockdown that's really kind of made me go like this, because it's like
Yeah, I mean, that is a good journey to go like through, like art to the science, because you also had the identification art items you've been doing for
so with that, so when I'm saying that whole of the last year, that's that what I'm calling my Seaweed Stories began from that rock pooling moment, and then I did a lot more, I guess, because we went straight into it. So it's interesting where it's not only art and science but also context that influences what it is that you're actually creating and the journey that you go on. So the context obviously being pandemic, being much more at home, needing to simplify what it was that I was actually creating. So normally, as you can see in the background, and as you know from looking at my stuff, it's very multi-layered, mixed media, a lot of processes, a lot of time, and I just needed to go back into kind of simplifying all of that. Is that all right?
My hair's not brushed well enough.
And so I was doing a lot of drawing and painting of the seaweeds that I was seeing, so able to get out and look on the cove, and then I think sort of simplifying that, but then went with a friend, we went sort of socially distanced seaweed exploring on the cove, and that was where more of the science kicked in for me as well. She's got a marine biology background, and we became real sort of seaweed sisters over the kind of lockdown period and all of last year, and that's where this work has sort of come from in a way. She was also, when she was out looking, she would bring me little tubs of seaweed up. And what we were then doing was what I call, what did I call it in some of my posts? Sort of naming, like, together apart. So we live not very far from each other. We'd both go down to the cove separately and look at seaweed on the way back and at home, and then we do WhatsApping across the sort of heathland to identify them. So it was more challenging in a way, but with a mixture of her knowledge, her greater knowledge of seaweed taxonomy and seaweed identification than mine. We could bring that together with the fact that I was looking down the scope at my end and able to see a bit more detail. So that was really where all the science and the arts, and I was drawing and painting as I went. So that's where that all kind of came together, I guess.
That's awesome. It's nice that it sort of connected you with people as well.
Yeah.
Right. Like, rather than just being like out in the winds at the coast picking up seaweed like alone, you've built a really lovely connection with people.
Absolutely, yeah. And I've noticed that sort of, so this kind of idea of the Seaweed Sisters, you know, I've sort of noticed that. I call her my Seaweed Sister here, but that's an international, you know, I feel like there's several people I connect with in Canada. So that's partly due to some research work I did in Canada a couple of years, you know, prior to this, with at the University of British Columbia. They've got an amazing herbarium stocked full of all sorts of incredible seaweeds, and so a contact there. I worked with her for a day, and then somebody else on the other side of the US, and then somebody in Australia, and it's just really, and New Zealand, and it's just really nice having all these kind of, and it is interesting that there are a lot of men looking at seaweeds, but it is really interesting, this kind of seaweed sisterhood, and that's also a science connection, because some of women, there was I don't know how much you know, but there were women back, you know, several hundred years, 300 years ago, that were able to do science of seaweeds in the way that they were perhaps prevented from doing other science. So there's the whole origins of some of our now taxonomy and our identification of seaweeds that was that women were quite instrumental in moving forwards. With their long skirts swishing in the tide pools and the rock pools. I think
I'd struggle, but
and we were a bit the same when I was doing it last year. I find myself with the kelp and the water up around my waist, tucking my skirt beneath, you know, one of those 18th century women.
Yeah, I sometimes do that when I'm walking. I'll like tuck the skirt into the top, and I'm like, oh, look at me. 1800s woman.
Yeah, that's right. So it's, again, another, you know, nice sort of connection with the arts and the science
and history.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, definitely.
So the next official question, I've gone on a few tangents,
yes,
but that's fine. What have you learned whilst you've been carrying out the Seaweed Stories? I mean, you've sort of touched on a few bits, but like, what would you say are the most important things you've learned?
So I think I've probably learned, again, both artistically in terms of process and creating what I love creating, and also, natural world scientifically as well. So I take the art side of things first, I suppose, that they're obviously inextricably linked, but I've learned, having said about that simplification, so that actually my drawing and painting is a side of me that previously has not really been unleashed. And I've always used it as a tool to just quickly kind of do designs for textile art, but very quickly got on to the textile art, seeing myself as a maker and a creator and a layer, a stitcher, and you know, on that kind of side of things. And I suppose the Seaweed Stories has really made me look close and want to draw, play with scale. So what I'm seeing close up, really kind of blow that up big so that it becomes large drawings and paintings. So pieces of seaweed that might have been or a whole blade of seaweed that might have been 1 centimetre or 2 centimetres in width, and looked at down the microscope, suddenly I'm wanting to kind of paint that on an A2 or bigger piece of paper. That's now becoming textile art, but it's, you know, it's that. So artistically, it's taken me in a slightly different kind of, the Seaweed Stories thing has taken me in a different way. But I would say both of them, it's about looking closer, and that process. And so therefore, and with the science side of things, obviously a massive amount of knowledge taken on in terms of looking closely and actually taking the time to identify things, rather than just going, that is a really gorgeous bit of seaweed. Going, okay, you've got the time right now, you don't need to be in the studio, have a proper look and have a look down the microscope and work out what it is, why it's different to something else, what it is about this kind of identification that gives me a better understanding of what I'm looking at right there and then, but also a better understanding of the ecosystem that it sits in, and that it exists in. Because, you know, by looking at things and identifying them, you get to know about their behavior, for want of a better word. Obviously it's algae, but yeah, what they need, what they give to the ecosystem and their habitat in general. And yeah, so I think that and using the microscope as part of that, just sort of further that scientific aspect of it as well, the looking at things at different scale and going right inside, being able to go right inside a plant or something, which is, you know, as you observe, something that I've done previously a little bit, but it hung well with the whole kind of creative process as well. I don't know, does that answer
It sort of sounds like adding the microscopy to it made it a bit more therapeutic in a way, because you're like taking the time to learn about the ecology of it, how it looks under the microscope, and then also doing the art, which is also very therapeutic.
Yeah, I think, yes, therapeutic in that it's making you slow down, using the microscope, and sort of, and in slowing down, you gain a greater appreciation of just how many levels of an ecosystem there are, whether you're looking at the local rock pool ecosystem or our planet Earth ecosystem. So I think that for me it did that, and I always describe it a bit as the way I felt when I first looked down at microscopes, because I don't have a science background, you know. I stopped science at you know, year 5 at school, whatever, so not 5, whatever it was then. I feel like, yeah, that bringing that to it has done that slowing down, but also, like you say, it then directly feeds into the artwork, because what you're looking at, so Alice falling down the rabbit hole and ending up in this whole other world, you're suddenly kind of seeing shapes and forms and patterns repeated and expanding, that you don't see with the naked eye, and that you don't see when you just first glimpse that beauty on the rock pool. And so by doing that, the art is coming from that. So the art is kind of focusing right into the detail of all those forms and structures and colours.
Let me asking which microscope you have.
I've only got, I mean, what I've actually got, I'm calling it a microscope. So when I've been doing work in other people's labs, I've used the lab microscopes that they've had there. But in fact, what I've got is it's a digital Wi-Fi microscope.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
So I can then take the photographs and I can work from those as well. So it's not got the power that some microscopes have got, but it's enough to be able to kind of get in there. Yeah.
My partner recently bought me a microscope for Christmas, and I was like, this is like the biggest present ever.
Yeah.
So I've been looking at mushrooms underneath it.
Brilliant.
And I found this a bit sad, but I found dead bees on the floor. So I dissected them and had a look. But yeah, it does, microscopy does build a really deep connection with whatever you're making the art of.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I've got one. I probably can't see them very well. I'll stand up and just get one. You might want to go on to this at another point, but that allows you to see where I've gone through with the microscope, looked at the Spherococcus or the Plutonium, or things that you and seen right into the detail. But yeah, I wouldn't have seen with the naked eye. So I think you're right. It does literally let you get right in there,
Yeah.
and then into another world. That's what I feel.
Yeah.
So.
I do quite like the idea of making the microscopic macroscopic, which is
Yeah.
kind of what you do. Like you make the small things really big for
Really
everyone
big.
to see and appreciate.
Yeah.
Especially if they don't have a microscope themselves.
No, which most people don't. And I think that's the thing. And I think part of that kind of wow factor. I mean, seaweed does have a wow factor anyway for a lot of people. But I think it's just kind of blowing it out even a little bit more and just saying this stuff is incredible. And we need to look after it.
We do.
And its habitat and hopefully that. And I think sometimes we all need a kind of either a falling in love moment or a shock moment to make us go, that really needs to be loved and cherished and looked after. And I think that goes hand in hand for me with the artwork that comes from that scientific process. And hopefully other people have that reaction and go on to then take a bit more time and thought in their own lives about the natural world.
I think that's a really good purpose to have with your art. Like actually actively inspiring people is just really lovely. So you've mentioned a lot of the type of artworks you do. So you do like painting, the textiles, but can you put a finger on which one's your favourite?
Really hard.
And I think
really hard. It's like, what's your favourite ice cream? It's expensive days. Part of the reason why I think I've got to where I've got to is because I've embraced the fact that I am not one particular art form. So it's where they all. So it's partly where they all combine. So it's where the drawing and the painting then either actually physically become worked into the textiles themselves, or they inspire different layering that I wouldn't have thought of. So they're part of a continual process. Although actually the drawings and paintings I've done from Seaweed Stories are actually being bought as original paintings and drawings in their own right. But I think I've renewed a love with drawing and painting, and a new type of drawing and painting over this last year. But it's definitely that mixing. When I'm so textile art, I think, is where my heart, when I'm sewing and I've created all the different layers, there's a real kind of meditation. There's a hard work bit, but there's also a flow bit that comes from working on the sewing machine, and it's free machine embroidery I do a lot, which I call drawing with a needle and a thread, and it's become much more taught in schools and colleges, which is great. So it's not this fear of a sewing machine that you have to sew in a straight line to get it right. It's just being able to play with it completely. And so when I'm working on that, and that may be kind of, I may be stitching a sea fan, you see the one in the background, not quite, or some of the plankton or some of the seaweeds or whatever it is, there's a lovely process and particularly because you get to look down at all the layers, and when I'm doing those, they're often multi-layered with a sheer layer over the top, and it may be, I love reusing materials and things that have gone underneath, so maybe shiny foils, and by looking down at it on the sewing machine, working away, that is bringing those other materials up to the surface, and I really love that process, and it's very like swimming and being in the rock pools. So it's got the same kind of meditative, observing, movement kind of process, which I love. So probably that, but that's a cheat answer because that's lots of different things.
No one will ever know. Yeah, you do have really, because I remember I was having a snoop on your Instagram.
Oh, were you?
Because I was picking out some things that might be interesting to talk about, and there was the I can't remember which fish it was.
Oh, this mackerel.
The mackerel, yeah, and then you had the foil that you'd been using, and then I believe at Easter time or something, you'd asked people to just send foil to you.
I get little packages in my post box, which is lovely.
That's really sweet.
People's Easter egg wraps. I used, with my previous career being environmental organisations and lots of environmentally driven community art projects, it's just second nature to find ways of reusing. Yeah. And so the foils has become, just a baseline for an awful lot of work. And that's going back 20 years really, using foils as a layer in fabric work.
Yeah, that's a good segue into another one of the questions, which is about because you're very environmentally aware, obviously you've worked with the environment a lot, so could you sort of share how you keep the creation of your artwork sustainable?
Yeah, it's
using the foil and things like that.
Yeah, that's right. It is a really good question, because I think a lot of artists have an environmental leaning or an awareness, or are interested in sustainability, but the actuality of it is quite challenging. Some of the materials that you might want to use. And I used to work a lot sort of outdoors in the woods and things like that, and all of that would therefore be natural materials which you knew were good to use there, creative, and would break down. And so that was that's a no-brainer, that's an easy bit. When you're then kind of working more studio based and creating pieces that you want to last, you've then got that challenge of making sure so I guess reuse is, as you're saying, so I reuse a lot of not only things like sweet foils and that to give a good effect, but also I will reuse every single scrap of material that I have. So I try to avoid, wherever possible, buying new fabrics. I don't tend to buy new fabrics for things. Either people know and very kindly donate to me now the right sort of materials. So there's that kind of aspect, of reuse aspect of it. But every or even all the threads that where I've been on the machine, or I've been sewing something, I'll collect all the sort of threads that I cut off, and they'll be reused in something. So I'll stitch them into something. So down to those sort of bits. And then I think really it's about I guess what I would call the sort of more, I guess on the more commercial side of it, packaging, making sure all of those things, so that make you, and suppliers, all of those kind of things go into that whole process of sustainability. If you are trying to make something that's an artwork that people are going to keep for generations, there are stages that go into that. Obviously you are buying some suppliers, you are getting some things in, and it's just choosing your suppliers as environmentally and sustainably as you possibly can. And as I say, packaging in the studio, I make sure everything is recycled, and everything that goes out goes in, even my bubble wrap, things like that. It's all so it's just trying to find ways of doing that. And working, for me, one of the big things as well is working with really good quality local printmakers and people like that, framers who will try and source. So there's that aspect of presenting your work to the outside world in a sustainable kind of way as possible. But
it is always about trying your best, and like you said, supporting local people as well.
There's lots of aspects to sustainability, I suppose. And one of those aspects of sustainability is making a piece of work that's going to last and give people pleasure for generations, and so that to me is part of that as well.
That's a really interesting point. I don't think I'd ever deeply thought about that, like wanting a piece of art to last for so long, and then having to consider the sustainability with it. But you're inspiring me, because whenever I sew, I always just throw out the bits of thread I've cut off, because I have no idea what to do with them.
I'm trying to see, I've just got them here. I'll show you. This is one of my grandma's old pudding glasses. But that was just where I was sewing yesterday, and it's full of all the threads. But those I'll put onto starch dissolvable fabric, and I'll just sew into all of those. When I next do my mackerel, or I next do something that needs that kind of shine, the plankton, you get used to that one.
Which we can talk about that now as well. So because obviously Seaweed Stories isn't your only project, you've done lots of work. So could you tell us a bit about your collaboration with the CPR survey, the Continuous Plankton Recorder?
So I I had a moment really when I was swimming in the cove down here 3-4 years ago, 4 years ago now. I suddenly went, we're swimming basically in this invisible suit.
Yeah.
You know, I was like, this is, I love it, but for other people that might feel a bit weird. But for me, that was a real kind of like, wow, you know, this is microscopic stuff we can't see with our naked eye, and yet is vital to life on Earth. So without that, nothing. And people attribute that knowledge to rainforests or to, you know, but not to that.
That plankton produce like most of the oxygen in the world anyway.
And yet we can't see it.
Yeah.
It's visible until we go into microscope world. And that was just a real kind of like, oh, I've known this for years because I did do environmental science at A level, and I, you know, been involved in the sector, so I know. But it was just that I was like swimming, whoa, it's all around me. So yeah, that then became a boat trip out of Newquay Harbour with Atlantic diver, a great couple that do a lot of have done a lot of collaboration with Cornwall Wildlife Trust whilst they've been out, do plankton tows and things like that for them. And then yeah, in touch with the Marine Biological Association that housed the Continuous Plankton Recorder Survey. And yeah, just went up and spent several sessions in the lab with them, looking at the silks that came in from their plankton tows that are obviously from all over the globe. And that in itself just blew my mind, that they were kind of collecting these in, and they had been doing for 60 years or whatever, and they've got these kind of, you know, and just going back and going there and looking at machines that they've used to tow the silks to collect the plankton, and was brilliant. And they were really helpful at, you know, explaining things to a non-science person, a lay person. And it just immediately kind of blew my mind what I was seeing, because obviously they were lab microscopes, and just it took me ages to get into it. And in fact, it's funny, being an artist, when I first looked down it, I was like, oh, I can see wavy lines. And she went, that's the silk. So, you know, it took me a while to kind of go, oh, and then it's just, yeah. So it was just lovely having that time, very kindly having that time to be there and to check in on species, and just to build up a little bit, very scratching the surface bit of understanding about phytoplankton and about the different areas and different, where they exist. And I loved one of the things I loved there, which is another really nice art science crossover, is that they use the Pantone colour chart when they get their plankton silks in from the ships. They use the Pantone colour chart, which is used by graphic designers and artists as a kind of reference point for colour. So which green is this? And they use that against their silks when they come in, and that gives them an indication of density of the phytoplankton in those areas, depending on where it's graded. And it was just things like that. And so there's pieces of work that are still coming out now. I mean, I'm still creating based on those kind of moments. So there's, yeah, lots of different aspects, not only of the phytoplankton forms and function and patterns themselves, but also the way in which science collates that information and shares it was really fascinating. So yeah, so lots of, it's still coming out from that. And but yeah, looking and seeing again, that's that where we talked about looking closely and just seeing things, is obviously that crossover, arts and science thing really. And I think that was a very particular time where I really went, oh yeah, because you can see them shifting and moving, and they seem to kind of turn inside out, and so it's really drawing you in and into a whole other world, like I was saying with the seaweed. So, yeah, it was great to be doing that.
Yeah, that sounds really cool. My voice is going. Yeah, whenever I'm looking down a microscope and you sort of like zoom through the layers, it always makes me feel like I'm in a Marvel film. Like
yes.
they're filming like a scene they're going through.
Exactly like that. Yeah, that's really true. And things seem to just shift and change. I'm trying to think, because what came out of some of that was some more 3D pieces that where I was making them out of wire and stitch.
That's
because
cool.
they become what you know when you're looking down the microscope, with especially when things suspended either in a little bit of water or in those silks, and you're seeing things. I mean, this is just what's happening on my sewing table just there, but it, you know, where you're seeing things kind of move, and you look at them, and I'd be going, but it's flat. She'll say, oh, just going a little bit further, and then suddenly you see,
Yeah.
there's
Do you like your work being quite interactive, like people touching it?
Yeah, I do. And that's been one of the hard things in COVID, actually, is that even when I have had times when I've opened the studio. So my studio gallery is normally open. Whenever I'm in here, people can come in. And that's, for me, that's a really important aspect of it. And that's been really hard this last year, working here, and when I have been you know, open by appointment or whatever, but having to say to people, really sorry, normally I would tell you to stroke all the textiles and pick everything up and get really interactive, and I just can't at the moment, but that'll come, that, you know, come back
in time.
Yeah, exactly. But no, you're right, it is really important for me, and particularly because of the materials I use.
I suppose you can always demonstrate it, like just now.
Absolutely.
You demonstrated really, I was like, ooh.
I was looking for the silico flagellate, actually, because that's a really nice clear one. I'll just get that. So this was one of my favourite, for some reason, I don't know why, favourite plankton, phytoplankton. So that's, yeah, and that's a lot of what becomes marine snow when it all falls down to the ground. But that's, again, wire and stitch. And it was just lovely being able to kind of play with it, like you say, when people are in, kind of show. That's what happens, even if they can't at the moment. We'll be able to.
Oh, I really love that. That's, I mean, we've sort of already talked about this, but I thought I'd just formally ask it. Do you think there's a sort of an intrinsic link between art and science?
Yeah, I do. Interestingly, it's not something that I started out as when I switched from doing lots of community and environmental arts to being not purely, but focusing mainly on having an artist studio and getting on with making art. It wasn't, you know, an art science crossover wasn't but I suppose it's just inherent in me that those two things link because of my kind of environmental concerns and the issues are there. So I think they are linked. I think it's up to obviously the individual artist, the individual scientist, as to where they see the crossovers being. I think both are about looking closer, as I've said, and detail, and both are about capturing and understanding something and using your expertise to either analyze or process or recreate, depending on which sort of camp you're in, and then share that sort of newfound expertise. So I would say that kind of process and that journey is common to both. Both have experiments.
Yeah,
both
that's
have things
very
that
true.
go right, things that go wrong.
Yeah.
You're learning all the time with both. And I think they very definitely are linked, and for me now they're definitely have become and will always be part of my practice.
Do you consider yourself as like a scientist?
That's interesting, isn't it? Yeah. No, I would say no. I would say I'm an artist, which I still find that hard to say simply, without kind of caveats. Because I don't want anything to seem elitist. I don't, because I want it to be accessible. But that's my issue rather than answering your question. So I would hesitate to call myself a scientist, but I would say that I have an ever-increasing interest in science and what science means and how science helps us to understand the world and to do the right thing by the planet, I would say. So yeah, I think they've both got their place in that. But I liked the way, I think when you mentioned something, you phrased it as, do you feel connected? I can't remember, do you feel connected to science or
yeah, that was one of the like sub questions of this.
Yeah, so I was going to say that's the sub question of that really. So I wouldn't call myself a scientist, but I definitely feel connected to science and the scientific processes and what can be gained by people in the world of science.
No, that is really like interesting, because I'm a biology student and I'm like, do I call myself a biologist? Like, I don't know.
Yeah, at what stage do you?
At what stage do you become like an official scientist?
Yeah.
So I've kind of over time come to the opinion that everyone can be a scientist, like showing interest in science, like you said, like just looking at things with a creative eye, and like I think that is science. I think science is so broad.
It is, and I think that's absolutely right to turn that question on its head and say, for scientists, there's a lot of creativity involved. There's a lot of risk taking. There's a lot of playing for a lot of scientists. So I think that's it. Yeah, definitely turn it on its head. And I think also I'm always at pains when people say, "Oh, can I come in and have a look at the studio?" I'm not artistic, and I'm saying, you are. Everyone is, creative, and I know sometimes that's a bit annoying coming from somebody who does art and it's the same for science, but I genuinely believe that it's just about finding your method, your route, your whatever it is that fires you up, and it fires you up into experimenting, into playing, or to understanding and to trying honing those techniques until you get something that because it doesn't come easy straight away to anybody.
No,
right? The art, all of that. So it is that kind of that will and that interest, and that's where, as scientists or artists or people in between doing other things,
science artists,
and anybody working in the conservation sector or anything like this, it's sort of holding on us to be, or it's not holding on us, but it's exciting when we're at that sort of interface and being able to kind of encourage other people into those areas to learn more and to experiment themselves, without feeling intimidated by it. And then that's where it's brilliant, all the citizen science stuff that's that has now become the norm for lots of setups is great, and I enjoy being part of that very much, like the Shore Search crew at the Wildlife Trust here, and various other surveys and things I've been involved in from an artistic point of view.
It is really good and really positive, and like you said, it is just finding what fits you, like what connects with you. Like take me, I've always struggled with like drawing with a pencil, but recently I've started wood carving, and for me that's really lovely because I'm like actively doing something and then like making clothes on the sewing machine. It's like, whew,
that's great.
it's fun,
absolutely.
But it's finding what connects you and not looking at art as just like one thing. It's everything.
It's everything, and exactly as you say, finding your path through it. I stopped doing art at school when I was 13. That was the last time I did art at school, and then just picked it up in my own way in different formats until I went back to college at 30 to do an art course, and that was when the skills and the techniques honing came in. So it's everybody finds their own path.
That is really, really cool. I love that. Right, so we're at the final question now, which I feel might be very difficult. And that is, what is your favorite seaweed or seaweeds? I'll let you say a few. I don't want to like restrict you too much.
It is a really tough question because they've all got their beauty and they've all got their and what's amazing, one of the things that amazes me with seaweed is how they change through the season. And this is a lot of what I got through this last year of actually really concentrating and following on seaweeds, was how the different phases of them, whether that's kind of reproductive phase or whether that's just how different they look in spring from how different they look when they've bleached in summer. So all of those kind of things. But I've fallen in love, particularly this year, with Placanium coxcomb. I don't know whether you're familiar with that one.
I'm just gonna nod because I don't know seaweed names very well. But I mean, if my mum was here, she would, because she like did a dissertation on seaweed.
Shall I show you?
Go for it. I feel like I'm making you do a lot of like exercise.
I'm in the studio. I might as well show you. So that's the recently embroidered version of the Placanium and the.
That's cool. Kind of looks a bit like crab. Like
the reason why it's coxcomb is because it has these sort of branchlets, for want of a better word, and then it has off that it has the same, so it's kind of a repeating pattern, getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and from that you can probably tell why I loved it, because I was looking at the microscope at it.
That is cool.
So each one then has the same pattern of combs, which is why it's called coxcomb, coming off it. So it's is
there like the same sort of number of them?
Yeah, and that helps to and for people who really have got decent microscopes and are really identifying, that you can identify different types of coxcomb by the number of combs that come off it, I think. But yeah, they are basically the same numbers throughout the closer in you get the microscope. Yeah.
Maths and art now.
Yeah, well, absolutely, yeah.
I mean, I like to run away from maths personally.
Yeah, me too. But, yeah.
Did you have any others, or is that just the
one?
No,
I think there are many others, and probably. How long have you got? I've been loving. I suppose there's ones that I love looking at in the water. There's also then ones that I've been loving exploring under the scope. So that's obviously where that one has come in. But also I think what I've been loving a lot is the sort of comparing and contrasting different ones whilst I've been drawing them, and whilst I've been creating textiles from them. So things like iridescence gets me every time. I know it's a popular one for everyone, but the condus business that you see off the shore here a lot, carotene, and that just gets me every time. Oh, look at the shiny purple.
Shiny.
So when it was Juliet Broden, he's one of the top seaweed scientists up at the Natural History Museum, she came down and did a course. When she first showed that to me, my mind was just blown completely. So that remains one of my favourites. And then comparing that with the false Irish moss, Mastacarpus, I love, because they've sort of, you think, oh, similarities at certain stages of the year, and then go off in wildly different directions at other years. And for the first time this year, when we were doing the Shore Search survey with the Wildlife Trust, I saw its flat black section. So normally it's kind of a fronding. Mastacarpus is a fronding kind of, it's got like the Condus crispus, but it at another phase is just looks like a lichen on the rock, and an encrusting algae, and that was the first time I saw that this year. So I think, yeah, that those ones are also a bit of fave. And then I love the bright greens of the Ulva, the sea lettuce, particularly contrasting with the pinks. So that's where I was meaning it depends partly what, if you see, I see that, I'll catch that out the corner of my eye in the rock pools, and I'll go, oh, that's that pink and green. And I always say there's rhymes, aren't there, about what should be seen with green, and it was always blue and green should never be seen, but I think pink and green should always be seen, especially in seaweed worlds and in seaweed art, because it's just fantastic kind of zing.
I think colours that don't seem to go together tend to actually go together the best.
Yeah, often, yeah.
Like pink and green, especially in nature, because it's such like an organised chaos of colours, which I always love.
Yeah. But and then it is interesting with those, like now the work that I'm doing now with the seaweeds is very bright and zingy, and the people who were doing the prints from my originals the other day went, this is about as close to neon with our printing inks as we can go. But actually, 10 years ago when I was looking at seaweeds, I was looking much more at a muted kind of more a palette that kind of, it's still embroidery, still kind of layering up from seaweeds, but it was much more almost paying homage to the Victorian collectors that we were talking about before, and so it was kind of quite delicate fronds, and I still do a bit of that in my rackline pieces, but yeah, it's interesting how how contrasted they are.
Oh, yeah. Well, that is all my questions. Is there anything else that you want to talk about, or?
I don't think so. I mean, I think, yeah, you've asked really great questions. And I think, yeah, asking those questions not only about the art, but where the art and the science has given me lots to think about, as well as, yeah, so, and it's, no,
oh, you go, sorry.
It's interesting because of this last year, me having mainly been in the studio by myself, working alone, whereas normally it's a very interactive environment where people are in all the time, as I said, and they're looking at the artwork and they're kind of asking me lots of questions about it. It's quite interesting. I've almost been, apart from that lovely communication with my seaweed sister on the ID and the collection of the seaweeds back last year, I've actually been creating in some ways in much more of a void, or just me and nature. So it's interesting you asking these questions. I have done quite a lot of thinking about this year, and thinking how the seaweed stuff relates to the plankton stuff, and even relates to some of my sort of stitched maps that I do, and think it's all, yeah, seeing where the connections are with that thinking time. So that's nice.
Yeah. I think on one of your posts, I can't remember exactly what you said, but it's something like nature is art. It was something like that. And I remember copying it and I put it in the folder, and I was like, that's going in this post.
Yeah, it's quite often, it's one I tend not to sort of try, and then I do tend not to over hashtag things too much, because I sort of think otherwise you're writing a whole other post, but I do get carried away because that's what sums things up sometimes, and that for me is a hashtag that I'll use often, nature is art, because it is, and that's where my background was. It was whether I was doing nature play or kind of environmental arts in the woods or whatever it was, in a more community setting rather than me kind of creating stuff. That's what it is. It's all there. Nature's there, and it's just us kind of absorbing the beauty and the interest and the intrigue that it brings to us, I think. I'm playing with that. So yeah, I think often when I've got disappointed with something I've created, and that does happen plenty of times over the years, it's been because, and I stop and put it to one side, and I go, well, actually, the piece, what inspired you to do it is so beautiful and is so interesting and is so complete in itself and part of an ecosystem that actually you can't recreate it, as much as you try as an artist. And that's where it's interesting going to these bigger, more abstracty works now, in a way, because that's sort of just embracing and acknowledging the artistic license that goes into recreating nature, because nature is art in itself.
That's really wholesome. You're gonna make me cry.
I don't want to be worthy and wholesome.
It reminds me a bit of like if you go in a forest and you try to take a picture, you can never get the colours of it right ever.
That's right.
It's just
that's
impossible.
Right. And I think, yeah, that's right. This is a very good example, because light plays into it, what you're seeing with all of your peripheral vision, and also your other senses. And this was always very important to me with the environmental arts and the nature play type work I was doing. It's senses, all of your senses that go into that work, or go into that experience at the time, and in the arts sector, I suppose, then go into kind of creating a piece of work. And that's why capturing the photograph of what you're seeing, it can be done by very good photographers, and can, on occasion we can get it right, but it's very hard to get it, isn't it?
I mean, on a mobile phone, it's practical.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that's the thing we're challenging ourselves even more by trying to get them done on my mobile phones.
Yeah, I think that brings us to the end, really, of the interview. So I kind of just don't want to like shut things off, because it's really interesting.
Yeah, well then thank you for the opportunity, because it is, as I say, it's really interesting always to kind of step back from what you're doing and talk about it a little bit, and that feeds in feeds in again to your own work. So that's nice from my point of view. And I really am interested in loving the sound of what you guys are all pulling together.
Yeah, I mean, it's very exciting. Thank you very much for taking the time to speak to me.